Zank, and you're listening to Deep Dive Podcast. So, I used to love Nara Smith, and I followed her for a super long time. I really enjoyed a lot of her content, but I think that it's time for all of us to unfollow her and similar creators like Ballerina Farm or Hannah Nealman and SDC Williams. And in this episode, I explain how tradwives and podcasters are feeding the alt-right pipeline. I even found out that apparently in 2020, Alex Earle posted a Trump flag on her Instagram story. So I guess my real question is, are none of the girlies safe? But when I started diving into it, I guess I was just started critically analyzing all of these influencers and content creators. And surprisingly, a lot of them are super roped into conservatism and I guess the alt-right pipeline. But I don't know, maybe it's not that surprising. But even the tech oligarchs that are involved with the Trump administration, like Peter Thiel, aesthetic of tradwives, which is short for traditional wives, it's centered around these completely false ideas of the past. And honestly, it's very nationalistic. I think that tradwives, they present this idyllic version of history that it's not real. And I didn't realize how dark it actually was until I went on Instagram Reels for the first time. So I only follow leftist content creators, and I wasn't expecting to see anything remotely conservative or far right when I was really bored and sick of TikTok. And I was like, well, why don't I look at Instagram Reels? But when I went on there a few weeks ago, it literally began with tradwife content. That's the first thing I ever saw on Reels. It was a tradwife post. And it got progressively more alt-right immediately. At first it was literally a Nara Smith video, and then after like 5 swipes, it was pushing Bible verses and the idea of submitting to your husband, and then it started even pushing raw milk, which, as we know, I am not the target demographic for raw milk. But I took a step back because I really like reconsidering anything that I'm enjoying or anything that I'm watching and consuming and my ideas constantly, because I think it's how we grow as people. So I guess I took a step back and I was like, why is this happening? Why am I getting all of this super conservative alt-right content? I know that the wellness to alt-right pipeline exists. That's pretty well established. But I was like, are tradwives functioning as a pipeline to the alt-right? And I know that often tradwives are linked to wellness, but I wanted to specifically look at just tradwives with kind of an exclusion of their pushing of wellness and how that's fueling the alt-right as well. So the first post that I ever saw about tradwives, they were Nara Smith videos. They seemed really harmless. It was just this woman who is making food and presenting this very calm, curated life in the best outfits that you've ever seen in your life. Clearly making a grilled cheese entirely from scratch, including the butter. That takes a lot of time. So she's kind of flaunting time as a luxury. But after I liked that post, all of my feeds started to get a lot darker really fast. And so when I started seeing posts from tradwives that were a lot more severe and traditional, I was really confused and concerned because they're not normal homemaking videos, and there is a difference, right? But these were people that were actively promoting this ideology, even if they weren't stating it, right? They were promoting it through their actions. And I guess that's when I realized that people like Nara Smith are kind of a gateway drug, really. That's kind of how they're functioning. And I feel like they're an entry point into this whole pipeline that we're seeing a massive rise in today. And of course it does work with algorithms to push the alt-right pipeline and to push conservatism very hard. My feed became this thing where women were talking about how they submit to their husbands and how you should too, because the Bible says that women are under their husbands and husbands are under God. And how these women, They live to serve their families and they don't work. So the idea that women staying home is the default and that it's traditional is actually completely false. Historically, only a very select few women have ever had the privilege of not working. And it's always, well, not always, but mostly been very wealthy, very white, upper middle class women, specifically from the Victorian era to like the 1950s. Women have always worked in jobs that fuel the economy. And the whole tradwife movement actually just ignores this and completely rewrites history in a way that's really deeply rooted in classism, right? And class shaming. And that's where you get the thing like, oh, careerists, which is crazy. So the thing is, like, the content became more religious as I kept scrolling. And it even started to get to the point where there was Bible verses on the screen as I was scrolling. So women would have like a background video of them like cooking or cleaning or taking care of kids or whatever, going about their day. But there would just be a Bible verse across the entire screen. And I was like, what is this? What is happening? And where is this coming from? And then I saw posts from this thing called EV Magazine. And this is a tradwife. I had to look at it, of course. So this is a tradwife online magazine that it promotes how to be a tradwife, how to submit to your husband. It promotes Christianity to the extreme. And it discusses how to be good at cooking and cleaning. And when I first looked at this, I started reading articles. And I was like, this is really weird. This company clearly hasn't been around for a long time. And where are they getting their funding? Like, where did they come from? So I was curious about the funding, and I typed in EV company tradwife funding. And that's when I found that Peter Thiel, the tech oligarch multi-billionaire who's super tied into the Trump administration, he had given EV, the parent company who owns EV Magazine, the tradwife magazine, he gave them $3,200,000 in seed funding for this app called 28, which is this anti-birth control cycle tracking app. It promotes like the rhythmic planning methods, so like tracking your cycle and not taking birth control and just using the known least effective method of birth control. Peter Thiel, he's crazy. He's super tied into the Trump administration. He's a billionaire and tech investor and entrepreneur, and he's actually best known as one of the founders of PayPal and for being an early investor in Facebook. And he's made a lot of money in the tech world, but he's also gained this reputation for supporting alt-right causes in politics, and he's known for libertarian beliefs, which is basically minimal government interference and regulation for businesses, but all of the government interference and regulation amongst individuals that you could possibly get. He talks a lot about like free markets and innovation, but specifically through like tech, right? And let's be honest, how innovative is PayPal? PayPal sucks. So, But he thinks that tech companies should operate with like the least regulation that is at all possible. And he talks about how he thinks that technology could disrupt and reshape society, which is exactly what we want to hear from a dude who's super tied in with the US government right now. He's invested in projects that even like try to figure out how we can start living on the moon. And like, I don't want to live on the moon. He can. But I'm not interested. He's like the worst kind of person, right? Because he believes in like little government regulation and control except over like individuals. Because why is he funding an app that's all about rhythmic cycle tracking and family planning? And then saying, oh, the government shouldn't be involved in my tech company, but I should be involved in influencing women and what they do with their bodies and if they work or not, and the tradwife movement and just all of this stuff. It's horrible. So Peter Thiel literally gave $3 million to a company that pushes tradwives and anti-birth control ideology. And obviously conservative media and these conservative alt-right influencers and tradwives are also pushing this ideology as well. And I guess that's really it. Like, tradwives are pushing extreme anti-feminist ideology, and this acts as a gateway into conservatism and the more extreme alt-right. I feel like it's easy to assume that these women who are championing these ideas of traditional gender roles and being a stay-at-home mom and conservative family values are actively pushing this agenda. And in some cases, I think that is true, that they're actively and consciously pushing the agenda. But I think that there are some figures who don't know that this is what they're doing. There are some people, some tradwives, who are super outspoken about their beliefs, and they try to use their platforms to influence others towards what they're doing, especially when it comes to promoting the nuclear family and being anti-feminism and different anti-LGBTQ plus sentiments and nationalism. But I don't think that all tradwives are actually knowingly pushing this ideology, right? I'm sure that a lot of them do genuinely believe that they're just living in a more simple and more fulfilling life by embracing these traditional gender roles, which they might be as individuals, but the danger comes from trying to force other people or influence other people to partake in this. They probably see themselves as just like rejecting the modern day and the pressures of careerism, as that one tradwife says, or the pressures of feminism, as in, legally being allowed to have a bank account with your name on it. And I guess just a lot of the chaos of capitalism in the modern world, but they're not naming it. But here's the thing, even if they're not consciously pushing this even larger political agenda, the ideology that they're promoting is a part of the agenda, and the ideology convinces people to join them, whether they know that they're participating in this alt-right nationalist and nostalgic ideology. The same values they usually believe are about family and stability are actually being used to push this conservative and xenophobic and anti-progressive and anti-left agenda. And I think that's where the problem really is. Like, it's not about what is malicious intent from individuals, but it's about how movements get picked up, amplified, and they're manipulated by these larger forces. And people who don't even know that they're participating in this movement and promoting it and getting other people to join, they might not even know, but they're still doing it, right? And it's their responsibility to monitor what they're doing and what they're promoting, so they can know that they're doing something that is actually good for the world and not something that's completely regressive, like the tradwife movement into the alt-right pipeline is. There's people outside yelling. Can you hear that? I'm gonna wait. 1 second. I'm gonna wait. And the thing is, tradwife content is promoted by social media algorithms to push these traditional and regressive ideas. I think that's another reason why it's important to look at the bigger picture, is because this content is being promoted regardless. Like YouTube algorithms, TikTok algorithms, every social media algorithm is found to push like alt-right and right-wing content a lot more than they push left-wing ideologies. I even heard on another podcast that tradwives are funded by right-wing organizations. I don't know if that's directly true. I couldn't find a source to confirm that. I do know that the Trump administration, Brad Parscale, the digital marketing manager guy for Trump's campaigns in 2016 and 2024, Brad Parscale, his whole thing was promoting and uplifting anti-woke influencers. That's exactly what he said. It was anti-woke influencers. And he's a super big figure in understanding how political messaging, especially far-right messaging, is getting amplified in social media. So they've been funding, So Parscale and his team have been funneling a lot of money into the anti-woke, as they call it, movement by supporting and funding these influencers who push narratives that oppose progressive values. And these influencers, who are usually on like Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok, they're using their platforms to spread messages that criticize progressive causes or even just make fun of it. The thing is, because some of these influencers, and we don't know which ones, are being funded and supported by political operatives like Brad Parscale, by funding these anti-woke messages, as they're calling it, they're able to completely amplify these messages, especially because the algorithms already work in the right wing's favor. Additionally, using social media and influencers disproportionately targets young adults and younger voters because they're more likely to be chronically online. So the goal is to create division and fear and I guess just outrage among people who are influenced by these content creators. And they're able to push this political agenda that aligns with alt-right conservative values. So even though some of these figures might seem like they're just promoting their own beliefs or what works well for them, we don't know which ones are funded by this larger coordinated effort on behalf of people like Brad Parscale, who are just using them as pawns, basically, to promote their own agenda. And it's all about shaping this greater narrative and controlling people, and particularly young people, and controlling how they view issues related to race and gender and politics as a whole. And this is why it's so important to understand the money that's behind these movements and issues of money in politics, of which there should be none, is because it's not just about free speech or people's individual opinions. It's actually a intentional and calculated effort to control the political landscape. And while I was thinking about all these things, I was like, it's weird how there's different types of content that's pushed by these tradwives, right? Because you have like different figures within the tradwife like content space, and they're pushing it in different ways, right? And that's when I realized there are 3 types of tradwives. So I think first there are the starter tradwives, who are more like your Nara Smith. And they are just showing you the lifestyle. They're not really commenting on it openly. Like, they're not like verbally talking about their lifestyle or why they do it or encouraging you to do it. They're just doing what they're doing, right? They're like not telling you to be a tradwife, but they're presenting it to you. And they make homemaking content. It looks beautiful and picture perfect and effortless, even though it takes them 8 hours to 2 days to make a single video of a recipe that's entirely from scratch, where they milled the flour themselves. They share their day-to-day life in their videos and photos and whatever. But that's definitely not an accurate representation of their day-to-day life. And then there's the mid-level tradwives after that. And these are more like Ballerina Farm, or Hannah Nealman is her name. And they're just showing you what their lifestyle is also, but they're also talking about why they do it, right? So they might talk about how like fulfilling it is, or how modern feminism has led women astray, or imply that, right? Like, oh, I'm so much happier. I used to have a job, but now I don't. My life is great now. You shouldn't do this. You can be a careerist if you want to, right? But they're talking about how they escaped like the horrors of capitalism through being a tradwife, when actually it's just because they're super wealthy or married super wealthy, and now all they have to do is cook for 12 hours a day. So these mid-level tradwives, they're not telling you why you should do it, but they are telling you why they do it, and that influences you also. And then after that, there's the extreme level tradwives, and they're actively promoting their ideology. They push Christianity. They tell women, why they should submit to their husbands and how it will make them happier, and they're talking about why women in general shouldn't work. And I guess they frame this as like the only moral way to be a woman, which is like to submit to like 1950s values that actually only applied to the extreme wealthy white women of that age. But they're saying that this is the only like fulfilling way for a woman to exist, and it's also to be like extremely Christian and to have a nuclear family. And I guess I think that this is why people like Nara Smith and others that are like her are a problem, right? Because even if you just start with these starter level trad wives, your algorithm will go further into the content that is promoting this more mid-level or extreme trad wife ideology, but also even just like minimally promoting it, or like just showing the lifestyle and why it's great for you without explaining like any of the nuance or how it's hard or how like you're privileged enough to be able to do that and it's not realistic for everyone. It can get people onto this completely dangerous pathway. So I think it's time to step away from watching this content. And honestly, I think that a lot more people need to be aware of how this type of content actually works, because the aesthetic is just the entry point. So this nostalgic rhetoric that favors the past, it dog whistles that there are no issues with homophobia or racism or sexism and so on. And it's just a like really like disturbing pattern that we've seen with political rhetoric across the globe, right? Because it doesn't only exist in America. We're seeing it everywhere. And as Taylor Swift said, nostalgia is a mind's trick. So if you look at the alt-right party in Germany, the one that just got 20% of the vote, so they're growing, but they didn't win the election. But it's called like Alternative for Germany. That's a translation. But it attempts to like manipulate the historic memory of what happened in Germany during the Holocaust. There's like this message behind them that's about forgetting history and rewriting it and downplaying atrocities like the Holocaust. It's not isolated, right? Like these parties, like this party in Germany is talking about not being pressed about the past anymore and like getting over it because it happened a long time ago and how there shouldn't be guilt about it. And this is exactly what we're seeing with the conservative party in America today, right? Make America great again. It's this nostalgic rhetoric that we also see in trad wives and podcasters. So within the AFD and MAGA, there's this like shared longing for the past, and they claim that this past is completely pure and just had way better values that everyone followed, and we know this isn't true. And this rhetoric isn't just about politics, but it's about shaping the ways that we think, feel, and act, even through non-political figures like trad wives, right? Because people watch things on Instagram or TikTok like they used to watch TV. So I think that trad wives and tracking the rhetoric that's being used through trad wives, podcasters, content creators, as well as political parties and political figures, I think it's a really good way to measure how language can be used to indoctrinate people and manipulate people. And I think that social media is the most insidious way that this is happening today. Probably because my screen time is like 5 hours a day, honestly. But I do read on my phone. So platforms like Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, they disproportionately promote right-wing content. But they also like typically target young people and young women specifically. And at first, people will start following these accounts for completely harmless reasons, really, like fashion tips or like, how do I decorate my house or what should I have for dinner tonight? But as people scroll on these social media websites, the content that they consume begins to completely shift towards the alt-right. It slowly escalates into that. And like, the rhetoric can become normalized in your head, especially if you're not like super solid in your beliefs, right? Because if you do have a solid foundation for what you believe, then you're less likely to be indoctrinated by this rhetoric. But if you're not well versed in like theory and like what you believe and why, you just know what you align with. But I guess if your like foundation isn't that strong, you're a lot easier to indoctrinate. And that's one of the reasons that like anti-intellectualism and the importance of education and foundational knowledge in these political ideologies is so important. And we're getting a lot of this more like extreme alt-right, right-wing tradwife content through tradwives and content creators like SDC Williams, who literally looks like one of the characters in The Purge. Like SDC Williams literally she was either in training to be a meteorologist or she was a meteorologist. But she completely gave that up to be a tradwife for her husband, and now she's all over Fox News. And sometimes they talk about, like, oh, it's a choice, like, you don't have to do what I do. But it's not about choice to them, right? It's just about control. First, women who aren't financially independent, who don't have savings or resources, if their family isn't wealthy or if they don't have a support system that can get them out of dangerous situations, they can get trapped because they follow what's set out in these narratives, right? They're led to believe that their value is tied to their role as wives and mothers, and then if they don't have income, right, if they get into a bad or abusive situation with their husbands, they can be completely trapped. And without any financial independence or assistance, a lot of these women's lives end up completely derailed and trapped. And that's because the system preys on their vulnerability. And I think they're using these like false empowerment kind of ideas to promote it also, right? Because they're like, oh no, I'm a lot more empowered than a woman who works constantly because I'm just taking care of my family and I'm chilling at home. Right? But it's false empowerment because women's freedoms are being restricted, right? Like, women who have the choice to stay home and do what they want, but they also have outs, that's not tradwives, okay? Like, there's a complete difference between, like, a woman who's actually, like, supported financially and has opportunities to escape or get out or go back to work or whatever if she so chooses. And there is a difference between choice and what's going on with this, like, tradwife rhetoric. And it lies in the reasons that people are doing it, but also, like, the ability to escape and the ability to get out of it. And that's super important to keep in mind. Especially because this movement disproportionately targets young women, right? So it mostly targets young women who are trying to figure out, like, who they are and what they're doing, and that's why it promotes, like, beauty and fashion and all of this stuff. Because they start by watching this completely harmless content, just lifestyle stuff. But over time, it pulls you deeper and deeper into this world. And when you're a younger woman and you're consuming stuff like this, and you're less likely to be completely solid in what you want to do in your life, it's so easy to get sucked in. I watched these videos for ages, really, like, ages. I was like, that's great. Looks really fun. I wasn't critically thinking for like a year there, but here I am. So like, I know, right? That's how this system traps women. And of course I discovered it and it was promoted heavily starting like 2 years, a year and a half before the like election cycle started, like before Joe Biden and Donald Trump at the time, before they started advertising their political platforms, right? Like, that had to be a concerted effort. And then as I was researching, I came across this interview with a former tradwife, and she talked about her experience as a tradwife. So she talked about how when you're a tradwife, the goalposts are always moving, and that you're never enough, and never traditional enough, or never pure enough. And she talked about how that's how the system traps women. She says that it leads to a cycle of self-blame, and women constantly feel like they're the ones failing when it's actually the system that's rigged against them, right? So when she first started, she was doing like some like starter tradwife stuff, right? But she felt like as she was getting involved in it, like she was never enough, and that other women who were doing it, like they never felt like she was doing enough, right? And that's how it kind of works, is because if everyone doesn't feel like they're doing enough, then it's constantly being pushed forward and more extreme. And it was hard for her to remember that, or like it was impossible for her to really even know at the time that the lives that are being promoted or advertised, not even in just social media, but amongst friends and like other people who are like following this type of lifestyle, it's not actually as picture perfect as they're making it seem, right? It's really easy to act. And for any of the ones whose lives do resemble what they're promoting, it's usually because they're extremely wealthy and they have people working in their homes. And I think because of these people who are presenting their lives in a picture perfect way, it leads to this cycle of self-blame where women feel like they're the ones failing when in reality it's this completely like false idea that's been promoted to them, and like the capitalist system that we're in is the one that's failing them. And I think this leads to a cycle of self-blame because these women will feel like they're failing when actually they're being presented this false reality as if it's actually achievable, but it's not. Like, people need to remember that women couldn't even open bank accounts until like 1975 without a man signing off on it. So it's a lot more bleak than people actually remember in the day-to-day. And I think that this is where the issue with class becomes super critical, is because most families today can't survive on a single income. Most individuals today can't even survive on a single income. But these tradwives who are making a living by promoting this lifestyle that's inaccessible to most by posting it on social media and getting brand deals and even accepting funding from people's political campaigns, they're pretending like they are living off of this single income and just taking care of the home when they're actually making a ton of money off of what they're doing. Like, usually they're actually the breadwinners of their families. And then when I was researching this, I came across a tradwife who actually had a link to PragerU in her TikTok bio, and it became even more clear how interconnected this actually is. Because here's the thing about PragerU, it's this ultra-conservative media site, and it's found its way into the Floridian education system, literally. Like, PragerU Kids is a confirmed educational resource in Florida schools. And this ultra-conservative, extreme right-wing video site, it's like right-wing, alt-right YouTube, right? Like, that's what PragerU is. But it's literally being promoted in schools. Like, this is actually so freaking bad. Like, it's much worse than I would have thought. But when I went on this site, I searched for tradwives, right? And then I discovered this awful woman named Peachy Keenan. And she is a figure in the movement, right? She wrote this awful book called Domestic Extremist: How to Win a Culture War. She pushes narrative of how the right wing needs to recruit more women into returning to traditional values, and this includes having more children to carry on their ideologies, right? And in her terrible book, she talked about birth rates constantly. She said that this is the main problem in the world, and the main problem with women and everything in society is that birth rates aren't higher, and she even says that we're facing a mass extinction event, which is literally, objectively, not true, and fake news and disinformation. So don't believe that. And if you don't believe me, Google it. She even equates women's liberation at some point in the book with The Handmaid's Tale. So she says that women's liberation and feminism is the same as The Handmaid's Tale. Did we read the same book? That's another essential question of this podcast. But, so she's suggesting that women's empowerment means rejecting women's rights as they are today. I really hate these people. Did you know that? Could you tell? But Keenan isn't the only voice in this rhetoric, and it's being promoted kind of everywhere. Like, in PragerU's videos for kids, there are literally videos targeted at young girls about, like, how much they should want to be traditional when they grow up and, like, support their husbands and take care of their families. I'm not kidding. Go on there. Go on PragerU Kids and look. It's horrific. But obviously, like, this stuff has pushed itself into the mainstream, like, rhetoric, I guess. And Peachy Keenan, she's just a part of this larger movement that's, I guess, pushing anti-education and anti-intellectualism. And this ties directly into the ongoing attacks on public education and the Department of Education that we're seeing today, and the rise of things like homeschooling, right? Because, okay, I'm not against all homeschooling, right? But there's a difference between, like, you've got, like, a lot of, like, former professors or people who are super passionate about education that homeschool. That's completely different. But then you have people who are against books and, you know, they don't teach you about education at all. I highly recommend reading the book Educated, actually, by Tara. I think her last name is Westover. But she grew up like this. She grew up homeschooled by people who hated education. She became interested in books and, like, fascinated by books, and she had to hide it from her family and ended up going to college, and later on she got into, like, Cambridge for graduate school, which was kind of crazy. But there's a complete difference between, like, people who are super passionate about education who are homeschooling kids and people who are against education that are homeschooling kids, right? Like, that obviously leads to completely different outcomes. So basically, these conservative YouTube sites, I guess, PragerU and PragerU Kids, they're being used to function as part of a broader plan to destroy public education and the Department of Education in the United States. And they aim to promote religious and just, like, fake news and fake science. Project 2025 is a really good guidebook to understanding how they're planning on dismantling the Department of Education and just educational structures as a whole within America. And I've got articles, and my last podcast discusses this. But I guess we're seeing this parallel push in the executive orders that were signed by Trump and the incoming cuts to the Department of Education that we're, like, waiting to see what they are exactly. But it's not really about education, right? It's just about maintaining control. And it's about promoting traditional values to children, so then eventually their children will hold those values, and so on, right? It's to establish this as the norm when it's actually not the norm. Like, progression is normal. That's what the world's been trying to do forever, right? Like, who wants to hit 1 year and then just maintain that forever? It's insane. But we've seen, like, over and over again that trying to hold on to, like, past or, like, traditional values and undermining any, like, intellectual development or progress, that this creates, like, a super dangerous precedent for the future. So we need to be careful about this, and we need to monitor it, and we need to fight against it in whatever way possible. And it's a lot more than just a budget decision, right? Like, they're trying to dismantle public education as a system and shift control to different schools, like charter schools and religious schools and private schools. It's not about balancing the budget, but it's about, like, changing the way that education functions. And conservatives have been vocal about this for a super long time. Like, Project 2025 literally discusses raising the amount of money given to each student by the federal government that's in school to match that of DC, which has the highest education rates in the country, or like education costs per head in the country, right? And that sounds like a good thing at first. But they want to raise it to $22,000. So $22,000 per student. And then they want to change the laws around funding for students by the federal government to allow federal government school spending for individual students to go to religious, charter, or private schools. So basically, they're going to send students paid for by the government to these private schools, religious schools, charter schools, and these schools that don't have hardly any regulations. Like charter schools, they don't have to be regulated. They're gonna get federal funding. Why? Don't you want an educated populace? I mean, they don't. That's the thing. They don't want an educated populace, and that's the problem, right? So it seems like on the surface that they're about giving parents choices, but it's not about that. It's about ensuring that their like ideological values are being upheld. And there's no reason that a government should be funding ideologies, right? Like, well, I mean, the US government has been known to do this for ages, but it's wrong, right? It shouldn't be happening. And like with PragerU Kids, they might just be in Florida now, but they're literally in the middle of negotiations and discussions with other states to be approved as educational resources there too. So like, you think it's just a Florida issue, but it's expanding everywhere across the country, right? Just like currently slowly, but as quickly as they can possibly do it. The shift in education isn't just about what kids are learning, but it's about making it so all future generations are accepting like a certain vision of America and the world, and that's why the tradwives are also obsessed with birthrights. And it's because they're trying to make it so everyone follows this ideology so it stomps out the left-wing ideology. We're literally spiraling towards idiocracy, right? Because like, if you think about it, if like each family that is trad has 8 conservative kids, and then each family that's not like super trad or alt-right only has 2, left-wing ideology gets stomped out in just terms of voters in the next 18 years. But that's why like the push for traditional values and anti-critical thinking and diversity and DIA and like intellectual like attacks, like that's why all of this is happening, right? Because like if people can critically think, and if they can read, and if they can process information, and if they can question things as they see them, that's a lot more dangerous to their ideology than anything else. And so the cuts to the Department of Education are extremely important, but they're also just another puzzle piece. And like, we really need to start focusing on putting all of this together, but it's one thing that we need to keep a close eye on, especially when you consider like things like funding for like special education or students who have like greater needs for accessibility. A lot of their funding comes from the Department of Education as well. And like within Project 2025, it even talks about allowing funding for kids with greater needs for accessibility or special education. It talks about their families being allowed to use their funding outside of the school system. Who knows if these places are going to be regulated or accredited, right? Because none of the other educational institutions or like support structures at Project 2025, like all of the other ones, they talk about, oh, this shouldn't be accredited, oh, this shouldn't be regulated, right? It's like, what kind of institutions are they going to try to send students with disabilities to? A lot of tradwives and like a lot of conservatives, as we see, like they're pushing the same stuff that we see in the wellness pipeline. Like we've got RFK Jr., the anti-vax dude with a brain-eating worm. The wellness pipeline is also tied in with like the tradwife like pipeline towards alt-right. You've got all these people pushing like anti-vax and raw milk and stuff like that. And like we know, for example, raw milk, it pushes like, well, it's seriously harmful. You can get E. coli, you can get salmonella. They're even finding bird flu in raw milk, and like cats are getting bird flu from like raw meat and raw milk and stuff like that. So it's super dangerous. So much of this space is filled with individuals who are co-opting wellness culture, which I think mostly started in good faith, and they're trying to pull more people towards like extreme political ideologies that are very alt-right. And I think a lot of it comes from a reaction to capitalism as well, and like more specifically like failures of like the healthcare system and health insurance and like United Healthcare and whatever. Because like healthcare is so outrageously expensive, right? And people seek control. That's what people want. People want control. And so like if you can't afford a cancer treatment, but you get convinced based off social media that you can control this by drinking raw milk, right? Like, I think it's a reaction to capitalism and a desire for control. And I think that's also where we're seeing like the promotion of like, oh, I have so much free time from these trad wives, right? Because like these things like healthcare, control, free time, they're luxuries, right? And they're like impossible to access under the capitalist structure. So really it's just like putting people's health at risk as a reaction to capitalism. And RFK Jr. in the Trump administration, he's been like leading this whole push into wellness culture and anti-vax and raw milk. And he's promoting the idea that like vaccines cause autism, right? And that they're not necessary when there's a measles outbreak. When was the last measles outbreak, especially of this size? And it's literally spreading to other countries too. They're finding it in Australia now. I think other places. Thank God I'm vaccinated. But it's not only about individuals either. Like, I think this mindset, it like extends into the media too. Podcasters, for example. I do want to talk about podcasters. But they function in the same way as like tradwives and other different like influencers and wellness influencers also. So they build followings by preying on people's fear quite a lot, right? Like people have a fear of illness or like a fear of being out of control or a fear of what's happening in the world. And a lot of these alt-right podcasters, they're offering them an alternative solution. And the more extreme views that a podcaster has, the more of an audience they're attracting, and also the more they're getting pushed in algorithms, right? Because any video or post that causes a big reaction, it gets pushed in algorithms way more because it gets way more engagement and interaction, right? So this stuff is super important and super targeted. These podcasters and media figures, they're not only focusing on health advice, but they're pushing political narratives that are rooted in conspiracy theories and mistrust of science and institutions and like this like super dangerous hyper masculinity that's like really sus. Like, and they're super tied into what's happening with like the rise of the alt-right in the United States right now. And one of the reasons that podcasters are so effective in spreading these ideas is because, like, especially the radical ones, most listeners trust the host super well. I'm not gonna lie to you, my camera literally died while I was recording, but I'm back. But one of the reasons that these podcasters are so effective in spreading ideas, especially radical ideas, is because of the trust that listeners put into podcast hosts. People feel like they're listening to things that are more authentic or more real than traditional media, which is crazy because traditional media is more regulated. It's not great. I'm not going to lie to you. Like, I don't like a lot of traditional media, and I usually listen to independent media sources, but these alt-right conservative podcasts spread a lot of disinformation. Hosts are often seen as like relatable figures that speak directly to their audience in a way that feels a lot more personal than traditional media. And because of that, listeners often think that they're more genuine and more factual than they actually are. And this dynamic can be super dangerous, especially when the content that's being shared is controversial or just straight up not true. And the algorithms that control these platforms like YouTube and Spotify and others, they actually reward this kind of content that is untrue or sparks some sort of like intense debate or controversy. So like the more radical and controversial the views of the podcast, the more likely they are to be amplified. And that's why shows like Joe Rogan have gained a lot of traction over the years. But over the years, his views have shifted towards the extreme right wing. And he's promoted a lot of like fake news and disinformation and conspiracy theories, especially about COVID. And it's not just him, but it's a pattern that we can see in a lot of these podcasts and across different podcast networks. Like Steve Bannon, he was studied by, I believe it was the Southern Poverty Law Center, but it's linked in my article, the source. But he's literally in the White House right now. But before that, his podcast was notorious for spreading misinformation, and it was actually found that 20% of his episodes were found to have spread some sort of misinformation or promoted false or misleading ideas. And this is how the alt-right operates. It's through disinformation, and it has been for a long time, and this is what they've been setting up for. They know how to leverage social media and how to manipulate algorithms and how to use platforms like podcasts and social media influencers to promote their narratives. And also, the alt-right works together, right? Like, the left does not do a great job of working together, especially when we compare it to how the alt-right is operating right now. So there's been some studies on like networks of alt-right podcasts and right-wing podcasts, and these hosts are showing up on each other's shows and they're repeating the same ideas over and over again. There's been networks of podcasts that were found to have like people showing up, like multiple, like dozens of people showing up on each other's shows, as many as 800 times, and promoting the same ideas on each other's shows. And through promoting the same ideas from different people on each other's shows, this legitimizes these ideas even if they're not based in fact. So when you hear something over and over again, it is a lot more believable. Like, you're more likely to say, oh, well, I heard 8 people say this one thing, so it must be true. And that's not actually how the world works. So that's why fact-checking is so important. But another interesting thing is that because podcasts aren't regulated by the Federal Communications Commission, they can't be held accountable for spreading misinformation in the same way that television networks or newspapers can be held accountable for promoting misinformation. So it's really important to watch out for podcasts specifically. This lack of accountability explains some of the push behind Project 2025, right? Because in Project 2025, they attacked the Federal Communications Commission and the PBS, like the public broadcasting systems of the United States, and like free press. They attack all of that a lot. And we're seeing it because through attacking mainstream media and like any like trustworthy media sources, and then promoting like unregulated right-wing podcasts or like media influencers that aren't actually bound by any regulations, that can promote a lot of misinformation that furthers their mission, right? You can fall into conspiracy theories super easily. We've all done it. I loved trad wives, right? Like, no one's immune. It's just about like checking what you're looking at and like checking your beliefs constantly. And that's how we can fight against it. And the data behind these podcasts is actually super scary in like a Kraken deep sea monster horror of the deep sea type of way. Like a study showed that nearly 50% of conservatives trust podcasts more than any other media source, which is terrifying. Whereas only like 20% of liberals trust podcasts more than any other media source. So we can see that that's working in co-opting more people and more conservatives into listening to podcasts and believing them as true, and listening to these like alt-right podcasters and podcast networks and believing that they're based in fact. And this influence also isn't just in the US, because like right-wing podcasters, they're showing up on podcasts from other countries. Hosts from the Nordic Frontier, which is an alt-right podcast in Norway, they appear on other US-based conservative podcasts, and even one of the hosts in the Tenant Media scandal, they were actually a Canadian podcaster, right? So that shows how the use of like podcasters and like alternative media sources is helping support the alt-right conservative swing that we're seeing across the world. And with Tenant Media, it's actually super interesting because 2 of the individuals that worked with Tenant Media were actually found to have taken money from like the Russian state media network to support their content, and basically they were catfished by some random dude, don't know who it is, some random dude in the Russian state who was trying to influence these podcasts. And they paid these podcasters like $400,000 each to spread Russian misinformation that Russia wanted to be spread within the United States on these podcasts. And this was being investigated by like the Department of Justice. But of course, because since Trump started, it's not going anywhere at this point. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because like we can see that there's targeted disinformation from other countries, and like also it's coming from within the United States too. So like the call isn't just coming from inside the house, but we can't neglect it and say that it's all Russia, right? That's completely irresponsible, because it's not. And the alt-right as a concept, like, well, as a self-identifier, kind of went away after 2017-ish. Like, a lot of people identified themselves as alt-right up into 2017, but it's not so commonly used as an identifier for people for themselves anymore. But the narratives and like the ideologies still exist, and they've just taken on a whole lot of new forms. And these new forms and like ways of self-identifying and referring to yourself, that's great for co-opting young people, right? Because if you can not use labels, then it's more easy to convince somebody else that your ideas align with theirs, especially if they're opposite to yours, because if you don't identify what the themes of their political ideology are, then you're less likely to see what they're promoting, if that makes sense. So a big part of this is like traditional gender roles, right? So because the narratives aren't about personal choices, they're about drawing people into right-wing ideologies through misleading and manipulative content. So one of the important factors to consider here is that the alt-right isn't gone, right? Because the term kind of dissipated after 2017 as a self-identifier, but the alt-right isn't gone, it's just taking on new forms. And a lot of people who are in the alt-right movement are avoiding self-descriptors, or that specific self-descriptor, right? But the term alt-right has significant baggage, which is why people aren't identifying themselves that way. And it's like the sooner you identify yourself, the sooner you give people a reason to reject you. But if somebody who's propelling the alt-right movement just is really vague and talks about things like tradition or Western values or free speech being under attack, then it's easier to introduce like radical right-wing ideologies without setting off alarm bells, especially in people whose like their foundations and their knowledge of their own political ideology hasn't been like very cemented, or if they don't understand like a lot of the like figures of their political theory. But the tactic is extremely effective because if you go piece by piece rather than all at once, it's a lot easier to co-opt people. Like, if you tell people, hey, join my extremist group, they're not going to join, right? But if you get them to slowly agree with, like, smaller aspects of it and, like, smaller points, like, shouldn't we protect free speech? then you can create this like ideological like slippery slope and pipeline that people begin falling down, right? And that's why these tradwives and why these podcasters are supporting this, or how they're supporting it, right? So we have to be really careful with how we move now and what we do and what we focus on. And I think a big part of that is education and critical thinking skills. Because these narratives aren't just about personal choices, but they're about drawing people into the right-wing ideologies, and it's through misleading or manipulative content that they can produce so easily, especially through these networks that they've established. And we even see that, look at Andrew Tate, right? Like, Andrew Tate was just brought into the US by Donald Trump when he's on trial in Romania for sex trafficking. Hello? No. Why are we protecting a human trafficker and saving him from trial and detention? But it's because he's been used to push alt-right ideologies in his freaking podcast. So I guess the next question is just, where does the left go from here, right? And is it like to create more left-wing content to combat the overwhelming right-wing perspective that we're seeing in media? I don't know, like, you could think that, but it's also more complex, because the right is constantly pushing their narratives, and what they're doing is they're doing it in a way that's shifting the Overton window. The Overton window is a range of ideas that's considered to be acceptable in mainstream discourse, and if you push that range further to the right, then anyone on the left, their ideas have to move more towards the right to seem socially acceptable. So they normalize more extreme right-wing, alt-right ideologies, and then those ideas begin to feel more normal to people, and then ideas that are on the left seem as more abnormal to people. So we have to normalize left ideas. We need to denormalize these harmful ideologies that are being promoted through a lot of different channels. So the rise of the tradwife narrative is extremely dangerous. Women are being drawn into a lifestyle that promotes nationalism, xenophobia, racism, classism, anti-LGBT, anti-feminism, and it's being promoted through social media, especially in wellness circles, but kind of everywhere across algorithms and through a lot of different, like, conservative media networks. But misinformation and nostalgic ideas that are just completely false are more trustworthy when they're being repeated to us over and over again. Like, there's been a normalization of right-wing ideologies, and we need to fight back against this in any way that we can. We have to denormalize these ideologies and push for more inclusive and truthful narratives and ensure that we're combating misinformation and focus on facts and science and both the social sciences and the hard sciences, right? Because, like, environmental science, biology, physics, those are important too, right? But the left needs to start organizing, right? Like, that's what we need. We need to organize and work together. But yeah, so I guess I've been talking for, like, kind of a long time now. And I guess that's kind of my point, is that we need to start organizing and fighting against this disinformation and these constant narratives that are being pushed to us. We need to be the opposite of that, right? Like, we need to fight fire with fire. So yeah, that's my take. Thank you for listening. This has been Deep Dive Podcast. My name is Freya Zank, and all music was composed and created by Nick Stanger. If you would like to support me, you can subscribe on Substack. Donations are never required, but they are appreciated. Or you can also buy me a coffee. You can subscribe monthly on Substack, or you can go on buymeacoffee.com and you can find me there to make a one-time donation. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time. Bye. Love you. Bye. Love you.